The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
Well, I think the Premier and his minister needs to go back to college and university to study math because their math doesn't add up. Then, later on The Agenda.
Mr. Mulroney, he had his flaws, he had his faults, but he had great strengths. He was a leader who led by conviction.
Also tonight.
This kind of learning is widespread in the animal kingdom. Birds learn how to build nests. Lots of animals learn how to communicate.
We've got nearly 50 colleges and universities in the province of Ontario, and they're all screaming for more money. It's a complicated problem. They say the province doesn't fund them enough. They say the feds cost them nearly $2 billion by cutting back on visas for foreign students who pay 6 or 7 times the tuition of Canadian students. And the province has frozen tuition fees for the past 5 years and will do so for another 3, which will deprive the post-secondary sector of even more money. What should we do? Fortunately, we have some free advice at this table, so let's welcome Peggy Sattler. She's the New Democrat MPP for London West. Adil Shamji, he's the Liberal MPP for Don Valley East. Mike Schreiner, leader of the Green Party of Ontario and the MPP for Guelph. And Alex Usher, president of Higher Education Strategy Associates, one of the country's foremost experts on the post-secondary world. And for the record, we did invite a representative of the Progressive Conservative government to join our little confab here, but they declined to respond to our requests. So that's why they're not here. But we're glad that you are. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Alex, to you right away. The government made an announcement a week ago that they were going to inject $1.3 billion into the post-secondary sector to recognize the financial difficulties everybody's having. That sounds like a lot of money. Is it?
It covers inflation for the next 3 years, and that's about all it does. So about $1 million, well, I mean, technically, I think about $700-800 million is for operating grants. There's a bunch of special purpose grants, and then there's a $200 million fund, which sounds like it's application-based, to compensate people for lost revenue from international students.
So the colleges and universities would have to apply for that money.
And they say they will give it to the neediest of the, and it's not clear how they're going to judge that. And are we talking total dollars? Are we talking percentage of dollars? And I suspect that funding is not all coming, any of it may not come this year. So we don't know how the numbers are being rolled out. I suspect it's actually back-end loaded rather than front-end loaded. So, but if you just say, $400 million a year, a little over $400 million a year for 3 years, yeah, that's a little bit more than inflation. And so it means that we won't get, the per student funding isn't going to get any worse, but it's still going to remain 10th out of 10, as it has been for nearly all of the last 40 years.
10th out of 10 provinces in terms of per student funding.
Yeah.
Peggy Sattler, how do you look at that $1.3 billion injection of money?
Well, the province had just gone through an exercise to appoint an expert blue ribbon panel to make some recommendations on how to deal with sustainability of the sector to ensure colleges and universities have the funding that they need. That panel made what some people describe as a very modest recommendation that a minimum of $2.5 billion is needed in increased government operating grants.
So we're a little over halfway there with this.
Yeah, and plus that panel had also recommended that there be additional revenues for colleges and universities through increased tuition. So what the government has offered is much less than that blue ribbon panel had advised, and it doesn't take into account the federal decision on the international student the cap, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Adil Shamji, your view.
As is so typical of this government, they provide a little bit to everyone, but never enough for anyone. This is too little, too late. We're dead last in the country for funding post-secondary education, dead last for funding operating. We're dead last for contributing provincial GDP, contributing from our provincial GDP to post-secondary education. We have, an unprecedented situation. 10 of, I think, 23 public universities reporting deficits right now. We have one university with many of thousands of their staff on strike. This is a drop in the bucket. And at the same time, for as much as the Premier might say that he's got the backs of students, not a single dollar is going towards OSAP in the midst of an affordability crisis.
The Student Assistance Plan.
Exactly. It's simply inadequate. It misses the mark entirely.
Mike Schreiner, your view.
Well, I think the Premier and his minister needs to go back to college and university to study math because their math doesn't add up. I mean, first of all, as Peggy said, the Blue Ribbon panel said $2.5 billion over 3 years. They gave 1.2, half of that. That was before the federal government made their decision to cap international students. That's going to cost universities $1.8 billion. So the $400 million per year over the next 3 years is like 20% of just dealing with the cost of the international student cap. Ontario, as my colleagues have said, ranked last of all provinces. If we want to even get up to the national average, that would be funding of around $7 billion. So it doesn't add up, and it's hurting our students, it's hurting our economy, and it's hurting our post-secondary education sector.
You referenced the federal visa situation, and let's get into that right now, because that will deprive the post-secondary system, cutting back on the number of foreign students, by $1.8 billion, as you suggested, Mike. So, Alex, next question becomes, was that the right move for the feds to take, given the impact it's about to have on 47 colleges and universities across this province?
I'm not sure what other choices they had, to be honest with you. I mean, colleges in particular, Ontario colleges in particular, got greedy over the last 2 or 3 years, and they brought in more students. And yes, originally, for some of them, that was about making up for government cutbacks. There's no question that the amount of money coming in from international students vastly exceeded what was cut from the budget for colleges. So, you're from that part of you're from Conestoga's part of the world, where they went from 11,000 to 33,000 students, and you see what that did to the housing market. I think Mark Miller went out and was pretty consistent for about 6 months and saying, guys, I'm going to do this.
The federal
don't make me
immigration
do
minister.
this. Yes, Mark Miller, the federal immigration minister, said, don't make me do this. And everybody ignored him. They just assumed he couldn't do it. And we have the situation we have. I think you can say, all these international students they're kind of an externality of governments not paying for funding. They said, look, you can't get money from domestic students. We're not going to give you money. The only place you can go and get money are international students. You can bring in more of them. You can charge them more money. And that's how the system has been working for the last 12 years.
But now you can't do that.
And now you can't do that. So,
okay, now I know Conestoga is not in either of your ridings.
Well, partly in my riding.
It's partly in your riding?
Yeah, they have a Guelph campus. Yep.
Oh, they've got a Guelph campus. That's right. Okay.
Yes.
They've got 30,000 foreign students. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I think that's too high, and I think most of the colleges sector would agree. The unintended consequence of the Ford government vastly underfunding our post-secondary sector is they desperately had to find revenue somehow. They went after international students. One of the unintended consequences of that, making the housing crisis worse. I mean, there's some infamous stories in Guelph of 30, 40 students lined up to view one highly overpriced apartment. People are so desperate to get housing. So, you know what? The Ford government, they've made the housing crisis worse because they made the post-secondary budget crisis worse.
Western is in London. You represent London. Huron University College is in London. You represent London.
Fanshawe.
Fanshawe, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
We've heard lots of stories about foreign students packing 10, 15 people into a single apartment because that's all they can get. Do you hear those stories?
Yeah, and actually there was a very tragic incident in London of some international students who were in an unregulated, very unsafe rooming house, essentially, without the proper exits, and they died in a fire. It is shameful what has happened in our system, but let's not forget that when the Ford government came in and decided to reduce tuition and then freeze tuition, It's created what has now become almost a $2 billion revenue hole for colleges and universities. And Ford was happy to encourage colleges and universities to make up for that loss of revenue with international student tuition. You know, he opened the door to more of these public-private partnerships. There were 6 when he was elected, which were supposed to be phased out. There's now 15 of those among our 24 colleges. And he actively encouraged institutions to deal with years of underfunding, the loss of tuition dollars, by aggressive recruitment of international students.
Well, this does raise a question on the other side of the coin, which is, since we're not getting the provincial funding that everybody around this table seems to think we need, since the number of Fordham students is going to be cut back and therefore that revenue is going to be denied, since tuition is still going to be frozen for the next 3 years, so there's going to be no uptick in revenue there, do we have to look at other more radical solutions? As in, Adil Shamji, do we have to close some colleges and universities because they're no longer sustainable under the current funding situation?
I would certainly hope not. I mean, if you look back on this province's proud history, we have been at the forefront of research, innovation, development. Our colleges and universities used to be the economic engine and powerhouse of our province and of the country. We need to be leaning into that. We need to be investing in that. Education always provides a return on investment.
Well, let me jump in here, because even when Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne were running the show, Liberal governments, Ontario was still, they were still 10th out of 10, weren't they? Or maybe
briefly 9th under McGuinty, but
briefly 9th.
But the freeze on new money to institutions started in 2014. It did start under Wynne.
Which was under the
Wynne
Liberals.
government preferred to spend money on students than on institutions, and that is where that starts. That path.
Everybody's got some dirt on their hands here, is my point.
Well, let's not forget at the same time we had some of the most generous student and OSAP funding at the time. I mean, in 2018, you know, until Doug Ford came in, not only did we have heavy investments in OSAP, we even had a debt-free tuition program to make sure people from the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds had access to the post-secondary education that they need and deserve to get out of a poverty trap.
Okay, but Alex, I really want to hit this on the head, which is, would you sit here today and say that we can afford to sustain and maintain a post-secondary system in this province that has 47 colleges and universities, plus all their accompanying satellite campuses as well? Can we do that?
Of course we can.
Of course
we can. So, I mean, the choice it's a choice to spend as little as Ontario does. It's not a choice any other province in the country makes. I think the worrying thing for me is that, frankly, is that the underfunding of post-secondary is so pan-partisan. It has been 40 years. It was 10th under 10 for most of the Liberal reign. It was 10th out of 10 under the NDP in the 1990s. Ontarians don't like spending money on post-secondary education.
Why not?
I haven't the faintest clue. But it does seem to, it's such an obvious observation when you look at the pattern of post-secondary funding for the last 30, 40 years.
Mike Schreiner, do we have to shut something down because we don't have enough money to sustain what we've got?
I don't think so. I think we have to look at spending priorities. We spend $7 billion a year in this province, being the only jurisdiction in North America to directly subsidize electricity prices. We spend $5 billion on post-secondary education. Why do people who make over $100,000 a year get a 25% rebate on their electricity bill? I think they can afford it. And that money could be redirected into our post-secondary education system. It's a matter of priorities.
I ask the treasurer that every year. You know that, eh?
I know you do.
Every year that the treasurer's on this show at budget time, I say, what are you spending $7 billion helping me pay my hydro bill for? Doesn't have a good answer yet.
He doesn't have a good answer. No. Why don't we put some of that, why don't we cap that, focus those subsidies on low and middle income households and redirect some of that money into post-secondary education?
Now, I appreciate that I'm not saying should we shut down Western. No, we're not going to shut down Western. But there are some institutions in this province that are barely hanging on, and there are lots more running deficits this year I think in fashions that have not been seen before in this province. Can we sustain the current system?
It is a matter of do we value public education or do we value post-secondary education? Do we understand the benefits that we collectively get from having a strong post-secondary system? And we saw with Laurentian, the impact of the situation at Laurentian, the impact that had on the local community. Post-secondary institutions, colleges and universities are anchor institutions in those communities, especially those smaller, rural, northern communities. They are a source of tremendous employment, cultural activities, economic drivers. They connect with local employers. So there are huge benefits from having a strong college and university sector. And the government has to recognize that. And they have to make the investment necessary to keep those institutions functioning.
The reference to Laurentian you made is the fact that the university basically
declared bankruptcy.
A few years ago.
Yeah, and the ripple
they lost
effects,
a lot of students after that.
Yeah, the ripple and the community, like small businesses, lost a lot of customers. The local employers lost a lot of workers. So it has a huge ripple effect throughout the economy.
Adel, I do talk to people in the system, not as many as Alex, but I do talk to people who will say, sotto voce, off camera, of course our system's too big. Of course we've got colleges and universities that are not sustainable and we should shut them down. But no politician's going to allow that because it looks bad. Why don't we just face facts here and, do what we have to do? It sounds like we're just afraid to do what has to be done.
I mean, the thing that has to be done is to adequately fund our post-secondary institutions.
But that doesn't seem to be an option. Hasn't been for 40 years. So if the option is not more money, what's the other alternative?
I guess I reject the premise of that question. I don't understand why that investment isn't seen as worthwhile. I mean, apart from being a politician, I'm a physician, wouldn't be here were it not for the support of the province, the support of the taxpayers through OSAP and grants and all of those kinds of things. I didn't come from a wealthy background, but now I'm in a position where I'm able to give back. I would hope that people believe that me and people like me are delivering a return on investment. And there are people like that across the post-secondary university sector, the college sector. We have an ambition to build 1.5 million homes by 2031. We don't have enough people in the trades. We need colleges to be graduating people that can do our plumbing and our welding and our carpentry. We're not going to meet the health human resource crisis, the housing crisis, the affordability crisis, the labor market shortage by shortchanging the education system.
In which case, Alex, okay, let's find out what we can. If we're not prepared to put $7 billion into the post-secondary system, as seems to be the need, if this government is not prepared to take the freeze off tuitions to allow that money to come in, if the feds are insisting fewer foreign students, therefore that money's not available either, what are your options at this stage?
So it sort of depends. So the financial hit is not going to fall equally across institutions, right? It's going to hit colleges more than universities, and by and large, it's going to hit northern colleges more than others because they were more dependent on these PPPs in Toronto.
PPPs?
The public-private partnerships, with the arrangements they had with private colleges in the Greater Toronto area. So this is a northern crisis. It's actually not, I don't think it's going to hit the southern institutions. And so the ones you got to worry about are places like Sioux College, Northern, fewer than 1,000 students. They've been teaching 6,000 or 7,000 students from India mainly in Toronto the last few years so they can take the profits from that and serve their catchment areas. It's really hard to serve the North. Like, one of the big things that Canadians don't talk about is how difficult it is to provide educational services in the North because you just don't have the class sizes that you require in order. So I take your point about there's lots of institutions. It's actually more that every institution tries to do a lot of different programs. And what you're going to see over the next 6 months, 18 months, is you're going to see a lot of program closures. Northern's not going to close. It might not have as many programs. And I've heard Sioux College apparently they suspended their intake of their social work until next January. There's a lot of programs that don't make. It's not just that the international students give a general subsidy. It's that there are certain programs that no longer make financial sense if you take the international students out of them. Used to be you could have, you could make a go with 20 students in that program. Suddenly you got 12. can't do it anymore. And that's what's going to, there will be dozens, there will be hundreds of program closures across the province, I think. At the universities, you probably won't see program closures. What you'll see is fewer courses offered. They won't have as many electives. Your class sizes will go up. The mental health and those kinds of social services that we have expected the last few years at universities will be worse. Like, it will be just, a general immiseration of the system.
Okay, well, let me try this with you, Mike Schreiner, and that is, I had a little, again, off the record, in the corridors kind of a chat with a progressive conservative MPP this past week, wouldn't come on the program, but did say the following. Have you checked the salaries that university presidents make? Have you checked what provosts make? Have you checked what faculty make? And they've got tenure to boot. Surely there's some money to be saved in that. Surely the universities could cut back on that. Is that an option?
Well, I mean, if you actually look at what a lot of universities and colleges are starting to do now, is they're contracting out faculty. So the number of faculty who are tenured, the number of people in those, higher priced positions are actually diminishing, and class sizes are going up. And I actually want to go to Alex's point. Like, when you start talking about cutting social worker programs from northern colleges, that means communities in the north will have fewer access to social workers, mental health workers. I mean, the reason we had a northern medical school because of shortage of doctors in the north. So it's going to have real implications for communities. And so, one of the things I'm hearing, especially from students, is they're having fewer and fewer classes taught by full-time faculty because universities and colleges simply don't have the money to hire full-time faculty anymore.
Okay, but Peggy, I'm going to follow up with you on this. Algoma University, Sault Ste. Marie, it's got a Toronto campus. Does that make sense?
Well, as I said, when the Ford government came in, they were very happy to allow international student tuition dollars to subsidize the delivery of post-secondary education. And Algoma has done that, recognizing that international students are much more likely to come to the Toronto campus of Algoma University rather than to go to the Sault. And Algoma has raised a lot of revenue to support the institution in the Sault, but it's not sustainable. You can't run a system like this. And this whole crisis, there's been lots of flags that have been raised, starting with David Trick when he was focused specifically on the public-private partnerships that the colleges were getting into. He did a report in 2017 recommending that they be phased out. We've had a number of Auditor General reports in Ontario about the over-reliance within the public colleges on international student tuition. We had a report from the auditor similarly with the university sector after the Laurentian bankruptcy, and she pointed out the over-reliance on international student tuition across the sector and the risks this creates because you don't know when that international student tuition dollars are going to disappear, as we are experiencing right now in this province.
Alex, I'll put that to you. That would be one institution of many that have relationships outside their jurisdiction. Algoma University's got a Toronto campus. Does that make sense?
Well, again, that was their attempt to escape the North. They tried to, they've got, I'm trying to remember how many programs they have, 20 or 30 programs that they're offering in Sault Ste. Marie. How do you run a university like that? Now, they used to be part of Laurentian. Like, I think we go back again. This is an example. This is going back. I think that was McGuinty period. They said Algoma's going to be a separate institution. And then under the Tories, they said, well, Hearst is going to be a separate institution. There has been this sort of picking away at Laurentian. There's this sort of a weird thing around nobody can quite figure out how to run higher education in Northern Ontario in a way that is financially sustainable. And I think, most places around the world, you have extra money that's there for rural and remote campuses. And Ontario does too. Ontario has a northern bonus to institutions. So they do get a little bit of extra money, but it's quite clearly nothing like what they need in order to serve It's the same story with how do you provide hospital coverage in small towns. It's all the same kinds of questions that get asked about serving thinly populated parts of the province, and Northern Ontario is pretty big and not that populated.
Okay, we got a few minutes left here. I want to touch on one more thing, and that is the freeze. There's a tuition freeze, has been for 5 years, will be for another 3. I know no politician at this table is going to say, sure, we should take the freeze off and make students pay more and their parents pay more, because that's probably an unpopular thing to do. But the Blue Ribbon Panel recommended it. So should we do it?
Well, when you read the Blue Ribbon Panel report, it says, it recommends, a 5% increase, and then it says something very important afterwards, associated with substantial investments in student supports and funding. And at a time when we are in an absolutely unprecedented affordability crisis, it doesn't make sense to be providing more money to the students than provide that money to the universities. Skip the middleman, deliver that funding to the universities and to the colleges, and don't put that additional stress on the students who really should be focusing on the one thing that counts, their education.
Got it. Mike Schreiner, your view, can you let tuition rise a little bit?
Not until the government fixes the cuts they made to the Ontario Student Assistance Program. They cut $1 billion from it, Steve. It's been one of the largest cuts they made in their very first budget, and it's only gotten worse. So until they restore that funding and convert more of the loans to grants, then no. If they fix OSAP, then we can talk about it.
Peggy, how about you?
Well, let's remember that under the Liberals, Ontario students at the undergraduate level and university were paying higher tuition than in any other province. So the decisions that the Ford government made in 2019 have taken Ontario down a couple of notches, but Ontario students are still paying well above the national average in terms of university tuition. I think we're like third or maybe fourth, but very high compared to other provinces. So Ontario students are contributing to their post-secondary education. We are in a cost of living crisis in this province. OREA, the Ontario Real Estate Association, released a report in the fall where they said that student debt is the biggest barrier to new home ownership for young people in this province. Young people are graduating from college and university with significant debt burden. It is causing them to delay all kinds of decisions like buying a new home, starting a family, and they're leaving. They're leaving the province. So we cannot burden students with additional student debt. We have to replace the funding that was removed from OSAP. But the biggest mistake that the Ford government made was when they made that reduction in the freeze to tuition, they did not replace it. And so that is what has caused such significant stress on colleges and universities. It's now up, I think it's $2 billion accumulated over those 5 years.
Alex, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
I mean, look, we're 25% off where tuition was 5 years ago. I mean, that's in real dollars, that's the size of the cut. The idea that the tuition is skyrocketing, like it's just not true, right? Like we're going backwards, and we're going backwards fast. And I think by the end of these 3 years, Ontario will be below the national average because I believe we're 7th this year, and it's falling fast because everybody else is rising. So and debt has not really gone up in about 20 years. It's stayed at about average debt is about 30,000. So you don't want those numbers to go up, right? But there's not some kind of increasing crisis that we have to worry about. I agree with what everyone has said about improving, bringing back some of the student aid measures. We don't need to bring back all of them because the feds have come in and they've started increasing spending. So actually now it would cost less to get back to where we were in 2018 with the Ontario Student Aid Plan. So, I mean, that's the answer. There's a lot of money to be gained on tuition, which I think we can unlock with a moderate amount of student aid spending.
I thank all 4 of you for coming into TVO tonight and giving all this free advice to the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. I'm sure they're, with rapt attention, going to read all of your comments. Thanks to Peggy Sattler, the MPP for London West, Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Greens and MPP for Guelph. On the other side of the table, Adil Shamji, the MPP for Don Valley East, Alex Usher, President, Higher Education Strategy Associates. Good job, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
tributes continue to pour in for Canada's 18th Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, someone who knew him very well and liked him very much, despite their political differences, is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. So, joining us now from New York City, there's Bob Rae, who was also Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 95. And Ambassador Rae, as I welcome you to the program, I have noted in some of the coverage that the first guy to call you when you became Premier in 1990 was Brian Mulroney. What do you remember from that call?
I remember it very vividly. He said, I hope you're enjoying yourself and taking it all in and really savoring the sweet taste of victory. I said, yeah, it's great. It's wonderful. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's not going to get any better. Like it's just going to be downhill from here. You got to understand the way it works. Yeah, I mean, he was that kind of a person. And I've talked, even since he's passed, I've talked to a lot of people who commented on my comment and said, yeah, he called me, he talked to me, and I had no idea. And he reached out. I didn't know him that well, but and this is not only true when the time he was in government, he was Prime Minister. It remained the case right up to the end in terms of his private life. I mean, he reached out a lot to people, and
now let me jump in
doing that.
Let me jump in with this, because you of course were a New Democrat at the time. He's a Conservative. Most of your support base, if not all of it, would have despised him by now. And I wonder whether you at some point thought to yourself, how am I going to work with this guy? How's this actually going to work?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, it was a constant challenge at the time. We were in office together for 3 years, and then I had 2 years with Mr. Chrétien. And I mean, the funny thing is that in personal terms, I got on very well with both of them. I had no personal challenges. I liked them both. I respected them both. They didn't particularly like each other that much, but they managed to work out a relationship. I think the challenge for us was that on policy grounds, on GST, on the free trade agreement, which had been concluded, and he'd won the election. But the most important bone of contention between us, Steve, was this decision that the Mulroney government made in 1989, which was to say that we will cap the transfers to Ontario for programs, and we'll cap British Columbia's, and we'll cap Ontario's, but we won't cap anybody else's. And this was just at the moment when we were on the brink of falling into a recession. So all of our payments for welfare, all of our payments on all of the things that are covered by the Canada Assistance Plan, our costs were going up just naturally, just by virtue of what was happening in the economy, much faster than any federal compensation. So we were falling further and further behind. And I had an ongoing argument with the government of Canada about how this discrimination against Ontario needed to end. He was not happy with that. He did not like to hear me saying it. We nearly blew up a premier's meeting because of it. And we then went on to release a report on it, and eventually, although it took a long time, eventually the federal government conceded the point. A lot of times people expected the Premier of Ontario was going to be this gentle guy in the middle of the country who was going to try to joke everybody along and move it along and get to a point. And I felt in the years that I was there that I had to be a bit more of a regional advocate and provincial advocate, because it was true and it was hurting us, and obviously it was hurting the provincial economy. So that was the one issue that made it hard. He had all kinds of reasons for not wanting to be seen with me.
Well, let me take you to an instance where he was happy to be seen with you, and that is because you two did manage to find a modus vivendi on the Charlottetown Accord in 1992, totally, where you came together. Now, tell me, he managed to get all of the premiers from all different parties on side for a constitutional agreement, which anybody in their right mind would have said That's impossible to do. What skills did he bring to the dance that enabled that to happen?
Well, I think he did it once with Meach. I felt he could do it again. I do think that having lost that ratification process, he was very good in the negotiation process, and I can remember one anecdote in Charlottetown itself when we were just coming down to the last moments. As often happens in a negotiation, one person will say, "Well, I can't live with this," to which another person says, well, if you can't live with that, I can't live. And all of a sudden, you can see the agreement starts to get very tenuous. And the Prime Minister turned to me and said, "Okay, you take Wells into the corner, and I'll take Barraza into another corner, and let's meet again in 10 minutes." So we broke up the meeting, and I went off to talk to Mr. Wells about something, and he went off to talk to Robert Barraza about something. And we came back, and he and I chatted. After that, we went to another room. We chatted together. I said, "I think we can do this. I think we can do that. I think we've got it." And we came back and said, "I think we've got a deal." And we stared at both of them, and they both sort of said, "Okay," But they accepted it. Now, Charlottetown was hard fought for, mainly because it was much bigger than Meach. It included Senate reform. It had significant Indigenous participation, and it had whole sections in the Accord on negotiations for self-government. It was, if I may say so, it was a very progressive document and a significant elaboration of some of the agreements on distinct society and other things that were in the Meach Lake Accord. But again, the failure was not in the negotiation process or getting 10 premiers to agree. The failure was in the ratification, this time a referendum, because the Prime Minister felt we needed to go to the whole people. And he felt at the beginning that he had all the wind in his sails and he could do it. But in truth, we were not able to get it over the finish line.
Well, let the record show Ontario did.
Let
the record show Ontario passed it by more than just over 50%.
Just not by much more than 50%. It did pass it. But you're right. I mean, that's really what that process is, what cemented our relationship, because we really did share a view about the country, and what it took flexibility, and it took imagination, and it took bringing people together to make it happen. And I think the Prime Minister was very generous in any public statements he made about Charlottetown, in ascribing some of it to me and to others who very actively participated in that process.
In our last couple of minutes here, let's acknowledge his successes were big, but so were also his mistakes. How much do you think the mistakes that he made, not just in office, but after he left the prime ministership, mar his overall legacy, in your view?
I think it's inevitable. I don't think in office. I think, look, in office, he did what he did. I mean, we all make mistakes in the sense of we make some policy decisions that people don't like, and that's life. I think the things that got him into trouble afterwards were the ethical issues that everybody's familiar with, and inevitably those things can get seized upon by people. My view is that he made a terrible mistake in judgment. He admits to it publicly. He said it to me personally, saying, "How could I have been so stupid?" And I must confess that I was taken aback by it in terms of the misjudgment. But in the end, I think if you know him as I did, you sort of say, "Well, it happened," and so yeah, that's part of the picture. But as Oliver Cromwell said when sitting for his portrait, paint me as you see me, warts and all. And so that's how we see Mr. Mulroney. He had his flaws, he had his faults, but he had great strengths. He was a leader who led by conviction, and he really did try to do some big things that were important. I didn't agree with every inch of all of them, but I think you can't take away from his abilities and his likability, frankly. He was a very hard person. I mean, the old Irish joke is, what's the point of having a grudge if you can't hold it forever? But the reality is, it was it's very difficult to hold a grudge against Brian Mulroney because of his charm and his persistence and his ability to bring people together in difficult circumstances. And, let's not forget that Brian in his heyday was probably the most popular politician in the country, won the biggest majority ever granted to anybody. And yeah, he tried to do some great things with that. He also had flaws and limitations, as we all do. But I think I've always felt that at the moment of passing, and even before, and what things that I've said to you and to our 5 listeners tonight is, look, I've said to Brian himself, as he knew that he was dying, and he was not dying, but he was failing, and he was feeling more frail, and I think, and all of us have over the years reached out to him and talked to him. You had to say to him, look, don't beat yourself up for what you didn't do, or even for what you did. Sins of omission and sins of commission. Take some pride in what you were able to do, and take some pride in the kind of person that you are. He was a kind man. He was a generous man. He didn't have a lot of mean-spiritedness in him. We had some old political scores to settle and so on, but he was somebody who gave a lot and who cared a lot. And above all, he did it with humor, and he did it with grace.
And with that, Ambassador Ray, I'm going to thank you for joining us on the agenda tonight and sharing your views about the late Brian Mulroney. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We would like to correct the record here on the agenda. Last Thursday, one of our guests inadvertently passed along some information that turned out to be incorrect. It was about the percentage of judicial appointees in Ontario appointed by the current federal Liberal government and who had made political contributions to the Liberal Party. The number given was wrong. The correct information is this: only 18% of Liberal government judicial appointees made political contributions. 18%. And of that group, about 3/4 donated to the Liberal Party. And we are happy to correct the record, which we have also done on social media.
Philosophy professor Kristin Andrews spends a lot of time thinking about how animals think. We talked to her about why understanding dolphin babysitters and whether rats have culture could enhance our multi-species world. Take a look.
I love going to shopping malls and just watching people walk around the shopping malls and do their very strange things. It's just as interesting as going to the forest in Indonesia and watching the orangutans or watching the ants in my backyard. We are weird animals. I'm Kristin Andrews. I'm professor of philosophy at York University and York Research Chair in Animal Minds. Philosophy is an approach to questions that don't have answers using purely scientific methods. It's a project that I think most people actually engage in all the time. Sometimes what philosophers have done in the past is they've assumed that the way the world is experienced by them is the same way for other people as well. And so they generalize from their own experiences to people across cultures, across genders. And as we know, that's not really the best way to figure out what people think or feel or how they experience things. And so we can ask these questions. Do chimpanzees plan for the future? When they remember things, do they replay them in their head the way we can visually replay walking around through our house? Let's think of an example of a mother dolphin who has a young calf. The infant needs all kinds of care and attention. The mothers sometimes get tired. What has been observed in many different dolphin communities is that other females will come over and kind of babysit. They'll take the dolphin infant away from the mother, or they will come near the mother when the mother's with the infant, as she always is, and then the mother will sink down to the really deep part of the sea where the infant can't go. And sometimes she just stays there and just rests. And the other females are there to take care of the infant. So the mother knows their infant's fine and she can just get a little bit of a break. That's the sort of thing that we can look at and say, this looks like it's a kind of case of empathy. They're doing it because they know she needs a break. What's really funny about humans and human scientists and philosophers is that we seem to think that the animals of interest are the animals that are the farthest away from where we live. And so there's been this tradition in the West of traveling to Africa to study chimpanzees or to Indonesia to study orangutans. And when I've been to Indonesia to study orangutans, the people I talk to, the Indonesian people I talk to say, why would you study the orangutans? I want to study the moose in Canada. I'm interested in squirrels. You have squirrels. Squirrels are so cool. Raccoons, I've heard all about raccoons. They're so interesting. And so we don't have to travel anywhere. We have animals all around us. Another thing that I think is very common for humans is to ask questions about animal minds when the animals are very big and exciting, the elephants and the dolphins and the chimpanzees and then corvids, ravens, the smart animals, so-called smart animals. Why do they have these reputations? It's very strange. We've studied them, and so we found out they're smart. And there are all these animals we haven't studied. And so I was really interested in, for example, studying rats. Why am I going to Indonesia when I could study these rats in my backyard? And so we got some rats and investigated whether rats have culture. Turning to the question of culture in rats and cognition and sociality in rats made me really open my mind to thinking about culture and sociality and cognition in lots of different species where we don't normally think of them. So you might think that animals are just, biologically destined to do the things they do. That birds just build nests innately, and that bees just go out and fly around innately, and they don't have to learn anything. And that learning is something special that we do, and chimpanzees and dolphins and elephants do. But actually, bees learn. They learn from each other. Ants learn. Fruit flies learn. If you give fruit flies, females, a display of other fruit flies, some with a little pink dot on them, some with a little blue dot on them, and they see other females mating with a pink guy, then they all want to have sex with pink guys and not the blue guys. So they learn that. They weren't born thinking pink painted fruit flies are hot. This kind of learning is widespread in the animal kingdom. Birds learn how to build nests. Lots of animals learn how to communicate. Meerkats will actively teach young meerkats how to eat scorpions. So you might think eating a scorpion is dangerous. You would be right about that. It's really hard for meerkats to learn how to eat a scorpion. And so they have teachers who deconstruct the task for them. The first time a young meerkat gets a scorpion to eat, they get a scorpion with the stinger off of it. So it's been already killed, the dangerous part's gone, and the juveniles can interact with it. As the juveniles get better, the teachers give them more and more complex parts of the scorpion to process. And with this kind of scaffolding, they then learn how to kill and eat scorpions on their own. And then they can teach it to the next generation of young meerkats. A scout bee will go and find a place where there's nectar or a new place to build a new hive, and they'll dance for this location. And they dance for an audience, so it's a social event. It's a communicative event. One thing that the audience can do is say, no, that's not a good place. I found a better place. So there's this signal called a stop signal that another bee can get up onto the stage, basically. They give a stop signal and kick the dancer off the stage, and then they start dancing financing for the other place. Grouper fish are big, they can't get into small crevices. Eels are small, they can get into crevices. A grouper can point to a place, hey, there's a fish down here, and then the eel goes down and gets it, and then they share the food. There's a lot of collaboration, a lot of interaction on the reef, in the savanna, in the forests, in the natural world. Intelligence is everywhere in the animal kingdom. What if we start studying consciousness in the worms? Because these systems don't have the kind of convoluted details and big brains that we have, we might be able to make a lot more progress in uncovering the mysteries of consciousness when we look for them in the small places, in the hidden places, hidden right in front of our faces in our backyards. We live in a multicultural society with other species and not just with other humans. We have to negotiate because there are differences. I mean, there are all these cases of wild animals who sometimes run afoul of humans in a variety of ways. Sometimes it results in human death, sometimes it results in animal death. It can be a real problem. And so how do we manage this? Lots of attempts to manage human-wildlife interaction between farmers and elephants in Thailand have involved methods like setting off firecrackers at the edges of the farms or making bee fences to try to use bees to keep the elephants away. And none of this is working very well. The elephants still just are more secretive when they come, and they learn from other elephants, it seems, about how to better sneak up into the farms to raid the gardens. The question is there another way? Instead of using brute force to keep the animals out, is there a way to negotiate with them that it would be better for them and for us, and we could be happier together if they would stay out of this area and maybe go to another area that was really beneficial? We interestingly know that wild animals are following these traditions that they've learned for over generations. The border between Germany and Czech, there used to be fences from the Cold War, right, walls. The deer, to this day, appear to obey the wall barrier, even though there's no wall there. The only reason for this is that they've learned it from elders, generation after generation, that we don't go past this line. When we're doing conservation projects and trying to get animals to move in new places, sometimes gates are created, gaps in fences are created to try to allow animals passage, or green corridors are built to get fragmented populations of wild animals to be able to interact with each other and procreate. But we have to also be able to encourage animals to use these green corridors. So how do we do that? They haven't gone this way. We've never gone over here before. We've never gone through this doorway. How do we encourage them to go through this doorway? One way to do that is to really talk to one of the high-ranking individuals in the community. What I mean is show that individual that this is a really beneficial place to go, that there are goodies here. So reinforce that behavior on an individual basis so that the animal trusts us and then comes to trust that area. Now, if a high-ranking animal trusts that area, then other animals who copy that behavior will then also use this highway crossing or this green corridor or this fence gap. And so this is a way of negotiating and changing norms in an animal society for the benefit of the animals and for the humans. So I have a book that I think is a super fun book called The Animal Mind. It's an introduction to the philosophy of animal cognition. So if you're interested in questions about animal consciousness and about animal rationality, I discuss social cognition and how good other species are at understanding the minds of one another. I also really investigate the question about whether animals could be moral actors, whether they have their own moral codes that they follow, and look at this from the perspective of philosophy and philosophical theories of ethics. One of the things I think is really important about thinking about animal culture and animal social norms has to do with animal welfare for captive animals. So a lot of the animals that we kind of know best are captive animals. So the pets that live in our houses, animals that we might see in the zoos or who are in laboratories. Sometimes what looks like a harmful behavior or behavior that animals doing that we should stop might not be a behavior that we should stop in that population, because that behavior might be significant to the animal culturally. And one of the reasons why the keepers and caregivers allow chimpanzees to play with feces and sometimes even eat feces is that the thought is that this might be a culturally important behavior for some communities of chimpanzees. Are there harms in eating feces? Well, sure, like there are pathogens. It's not something that we'd recommend, but there are also harms to lots of important cultural behaviors that humans engage in, right? When we pierce our body or tattoo our skin, we're also risking infection. Is it going to kill us? No. Is eating poop going to kill the chimpanzees? No. We have to be really careful that we're not kind of enforcing our own cultural norms onto other animal species or animal groups just because it makes us uncomfortable or it seems gross or somehow problematic to us. This is where it's important for us to develop empathy with the other animals and try to see from their perspective why this behavior might be important. You might think, like, what can I do to help other animals because I don't work at a zoo or work in a lab? But if you've got a dog at home or some other sort of a pet, you can do the same sort of empathic practice with your own animal that I've been talking about. For example, when I walk my dog, the walks are very, very slow or very, very fast, depending on what my dog Riddle wants to do. Sometimes he just wants to sniff everywhere and pee on every little piece of grass he can find. And I let him do that. Not because I see value in peeing on the grass and sniffing everybody else's pee, but because it's important to him. And it's really important for dogs when they want to know what's going on in the neighborhood that they have this opportunity to sniff and smell. Imagine every time you went to answer a text, someone stole your phone. That's kind of what happens when you're walking a dog and you don't let them sniff. Humans don't seem to recognize that we could be interacting with other species as much as we do. And this kind of learning about how animals survive in what is a multi-species and multicultural environment, I think might help us understand better how we can thrive in our own multicultural environments when we're just dealing with human cultures, but also our multicultural, multi-species environment.
Tomorrow.
We recycle old ships of all types, warships, freighters, tugs, barges, submarines. We've recycled actually pretty much everything except an aircraft carrier.
That's tomorrow.